Hey friends, welcome to Rubrix Cube. My name is Becky Haddad, and I hope you are joining me comfy in your own home with fuzzy socks and your favorite mug of whatever it is you love to do professional development to. Today we're talking about demystifying assessment, and we're going to jump in hopefully so you have some time. If you allotted your half hour for this workshop, I'm really hoping that you can use remaining time at the end of this workshop to dig in on a rubric that you already have. So let's get started. So first off, we want to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what rubrics do. Rubrics do a ton. And I do want to preface this by saying rubrics don't do everything. They're not perfect for every assessment. Rubrics are awesome for assessments where you have a lot of things to grade and you want to give really descriptive feedback to students. Rubrics are also best used when we can give them to students before the assessment is actually due so that they can see how they're going to be scored before it's assigned. And essentially, a rubric tells them what means I've done a good job. So rubrics, especially when used so students can self-assess as well, help define quality, clarify expectations, describe quality for stakeholders, focus our teaching, guide interventions, promote descriptive feedback, as well as student self-assessment and student goal setting. They also help us track student achievement and then make judgments both objective and consistent, which overall improves our grading consistency. Now at this point, you might be saying, wait, what? Yes, really, rubrics can do all that. One of the common things though we hear from students is that this rubric tells us how to get a good score, but it doesn't tell us how to create a quality assignment. In this case, this fifth grader said good writing. And so when we think about rubrics as really the secret to grading, sometimes we have this idea that we're not going to give students rubrics. That's not really fair. That's cheating. That's not letting them really use their creative potential. And it's just telling them exactly how to do the assignment. But it should tell them exactly how to do the assignment. When our expectations are clear, our students can much better show us how well they know the content and how well they've engaged with the content. And so it really lets them take some stress away, helps us assess what they actually know rather than assess other things that aren't really part of the process. So we don't want to assess things like stress. We don't want to assess things like their actual, having to process or having to understand the expectations. If our expectations are really clear, we can assess a lot more on how well they know the content. And so really kind of where we're headed today is recognizing that rubrics can describe a progression of skill from novice to expert, but really what we want to do today is focus in on a rubric not so much for skill development, but a rubric that combines insight and performance related to understanding of ideas and meaning. And that's from Wiggins and McTee in I Teach Because I Can. And a lot of what we're going to be thinking about today comes from classroom assessment for student learning, which is from Chapuis and Stiggins. And so there are a couple types of rubrics that we could be looking at for the various projects that we might engage. For one of my classes that I teach, I want to make sure that students get continuous feedback. And so if a student can continue to improve in this area, so if it's an iterative assignment where students get to try multiple times to do the same assignment, I want to be able to leave feedback so they can continue to improve. So actionable feedback in this rating space allows students to really think about how am I moving this forward. And so in this case, if I can tell them kind of what I'm processing from their writing, they're able to take that and move that into their future drafts. The other type of rubric that we can use is more of an evaluative rubric that tells students how they did. We don't do as much writing on this rubric because this rubric is more of a final thing students don't have the opportunity to redo. We want students to take their feedback and know how they did and be able to score themselves and say, did I analyze this appropriately? Did I have the right focus? Did my critical thinking shine through? And so that's more of the rubric that we're talking about today, though both rubrics kind of fall under the categories and the functions of rubrics as we're going to discuss them. So some of the things that you're going to hear me talk about today include rubric terminology. So when we think about this informal rubric, there are a couple pieces that we want to think about in terms of what our rubrics can do. And the first is those criteria. So key independently varying dimensions of quality. One of the toughest things about rubrics is making sure that they don't double ding students or they don't catch students twice for the same error. And so when we think about these independently varying dimensions of quality, we want to make sure that each of our criteria stand alone and are separate from the other. We also want to think about these indicators, so features of each criteria. And in these, we've got longer descriptions that don't show here, but tell us a little bit more about what it actually means to analyze something, what it means to have focus in our writing, what it means to really show critical thinking. And then we want to talk about that scale defining those degrees of quality. So in this case, we have meets expectations, partially meets expectations, and does not meet expectations. My personal preference is to be really careful with language that talks about exceeding expectations. If there's something that exceeds expectations, that's really beyond what we're asking students to do. We want our students to meet our expectations, and if they exceed it, great. We can make comments on that. We can save their work as really awesome examples, but we want to be careful about scoring them on going above and beyond. If they're going above and beyond, again, that's awesome, but what we want our rubric to convey is that you met our expectations, and our expectations are that you did this 100% well. Same thing with descriptors. It's one thing to say we meet expectations. It's another thing then to tell our students what it means to meet those expectations. And so giving those clear details regarding the indicators to say, what does it mean to have met the expectations? What does it mean to partially meet the expectations? What does it mean to not have met the expectations? And also recognizing what does it mean in your own feedback for students as far as where they fell in these ratings. In addition, we want to think about our rubric content. So asking, what am I assessing? What are we looking for in the final product? And what will count? These questions start before we start putting anything on a grid. This is the very beginning of our rubric development. So thinking about, again, what am I assessing? What do I want to see from my students that tells me that they know the content? What are we looking for in the final product? This might be evidence of creativity, of critical thinking. These are more the type of assessment type things that help students understand how to actually structure whatever they're handing in so that it looks the way we want it to look. And then what will count? So essentially, to what degree do they need to meet the indicators of assessment? And in what degree do they need to meet the formatting or the requirements of whatever that final product actually is? That's when we're ready to finally put it into that grid in terms of that rubric structure. And so we think about the number of criteria. This is a balance partly depending on grade level, partly depending on the assignment. In general, more than 5 indicators get really challenging for students to balance in terms of those criteria and what they're trying to do. It also becomes a challenge for us as teachers to make sure that those are independent criteria. And so making sure that our number is appropriate to allow for independence, but also appropriate to allow students to self-assess. And so it's not an overwhelming list of criteria, and students can really easily use that tool to be able to assess themselves. That also leads us to thinking about the grouping of descriptors. And so what are our levels to which students can accomplish this and do well? Same thing as far as where do we meet? And so you saw with 3, we had partially meets. I'll also use approaching expectations if I have more indicators to use. Keep in mind too, as far as number of points, it's often easier to use a smaller number of points with rubrics. There's a greater perceived space for students from 10 points to 1 point than there is from 3 points to 1 point or 5 points to 1 point. So if there's a point in between, it's a lot easier for students to say, okay, here's where this is. If there are 2 or 5 points in between, it gets a lot harder for students to understand that gray area. And then rubrics don't actually expedite your grading. They make a lot more work because you have to explain the space in between. And so in general, when using rubrics, I recommend smaller point values in between. That really helps with those number of levels being much more manageable for you, both as a grader and for students in approaching that feedback, so they don't get hung up on the number. They can focus more on the specific feedback in the rubric. So let's take a minute to look at a couple examples. First, when we look at this rubric, this is a rubric for website design. We've got big spacing in between our descriptors. We go from 15 points to 0 points. That means there's a lot more that we have to fill in for students in terms of what's actually there. That takes away from our objectivity, and that takes away from us being really descriptive. Because maybe they have those 3 pages, a home page and 2 additional pages. Maybe those 2 additional pages aren't what was in the assignment. Maybe they didn't have a home page, but they still had 3 pages. And so we have a lot more that we have to outline for students in terms of why we're giving them a certain score. And so instead of focusing on feedback, we're focused on a score. And so again, thinking about that narrower point range, And those more clear descriptors, those things really help both expedite our grading and help make us more objective as we give that feedback. Instead, when we think about maybe a research presentation, being really clear, we still have kind of big gaps in this rubric, and we don't have those clear descriptors as far as expectations are concerned, but we have more descriptive feedback here in terms of format, in terms of something being attractive, using a non-white background, having that color, size, font, those types that are appropriate here when we think about PowerPoint design. When we have length, they've met an appropriate length of 5 to 8 slides, and we give those descriptors as far as where those points go depending on how many slides over or under you are in the presentation. This presentation is a lot more about actually using PowerPoint, just for clarification, than it is about doing research. So just a heads up there as far as kind of what you're seeing here. I wouldn't recommend necessarily, unless you're scoring a PowerPoint, to take this and apply it to a research presentation. You'll have other things you'll want to score that way. Same thing with using transitions in VoiceOver. It's more about using those competencies and those key abilities in PowerPoint than it is about the research piece. So when we think about those ratings, these tell students what they did relative to the competency and could they perform that individual thing. This would translate really easily into welding when we think about some of those different criteria that we want students to meet in their welds. So do they meet those criteria, and what are our points assigned for those different criteria they may need to meet? And so that brings us to your turn. You're welcome to go back and replay any portions of this presentation, but at this point, we've got about 15 minutes left in your allotted time today. And so I want you to take an upcoming assignment or project, either that has a rubric or that doesn't. So you can edit a rubric, or you can make one that doesn't currently exist, and identify what are you assessing. So whether you're going back to content standards, student learning outcomes, really thinking about what am I assessing in students about this content? What are you looking for in that final product? So what are some of the design things we need to keep in mind? What are some of the formatting things you want students to address as they put that final product together? And then really think about what will count, and that'll help you decide those rubric criteria. As you organize those, then that's thinking about the number of criteria. Keep in mind, we want those criteria to be independent. We want to have those descriptors clearly grouped, and we want to have a reasonable number of levels relative to what we're trying to assess. And again, using smaller point values helps with that. As you work through that, I really appreciate your time in this quick overview of rubrics today. I would welcome your questions as you continue to process through developing or reassessing or editing a rubric that already exists. And I'm super excited for you to get to process rubrics and continue developing your assessment through rubrics. Thanks for being here today, and best wishes as you unlock your own Rubrix Cube.